While others here today are going to be talking about Israel's war and Ben-Gvir's war on resistance in the West Bank, I think it's really important to acknowledge that this war doesn't end there. It surpasses Israeli prison walls in so many respects. And this is very clear in Ben-Gvir's recent policies pertaining to Palestinian prisoners. To start with, prisons have always been a key strategy for Israel's occupation scheme. Since the beginning of the occupation, they've 700,000 Palestinians, over 700,000 Palestinians have experienced detention in some form. That constitutes 40% of the entire male Palestinian population. That's severe. And this new National Security Minister Ben-Gvir is making this perfectly clear, that this is a part of his strategy, especially with these new punitive measures that he's put in place. Many of these measures are targeting what he refers to as luxury conditions or hotel conditions that supposedly exist within Israeli prisons, which to Ben-Gvir include the most basic of human rights, including the right to sustenance, food, water, the right to a family life, even space. He's now trying to even bar Palestinians from receiving the little dental and medical treatment that they receive at this moment. The reality of what these conditions look like is constant physical and psychological torture, constant beatings, psychological torture in the sense that they're constantly employing solitary confinement against prisoners like Ahmed Manasra, who I believe is in solitary confinement at this moment. The denial of medical care. For example, with Walid Dhaka, who's in prison right now suffering from cancer, and they're refusing to provide him with any medical treatment or access to medical providers. And a recent study even by Save the Children, over 70% of Palestinian child detainees have reported suffering from hunger and not being fed sufficiently in prison. There's severe overcrowding, especially with Israel's recent crackdowns in the West Bank. Poor sanitation. Many of these prisons are infested with rodents, and especially during the summer, snakes, scorpions, things of this nature. And it was even reported over the summer during the heat waves that Israeli prison authorities were confiscating the fans of prisoners, causing them to suffer even more in these very poorly run and built facilities, many of them which date back to the British Mandate period. They're very old, rundown facilities that are not invested in properly in consideration with how often Israel employs them. So another way that Ben-Gvir has attacked these luxury conditions, which apparently exist in Israeli occupation prisons, is to crack down on different things. For example, shower times. He's now accusing Palestinian political prisoners of intentionally wasting the water of the Israeli prison service. And so now he's cutting them back to 4 minutes per shower, only allowing the water to run for an hour every day. And these measures are only going to further risk the spread of disease as access to hygiene becomes more restricted and becomes a punitive measure. He's also now, a few months ago, decided that he wants to crack down on Palestinian bakeries within prison. So he says that the idea of Palestinian prisoners being able to bake bread and supply their fellow prisoners with bread is a luxury and, quote, a privilege and a, quote, absurdity that they would be given access to something as luxurious as bread. So he's currently doing everything that he can to fight against the little humanity that Palestinians receive in prison. And it's not even that they receive, it's really that they've created for themselves, but he's doing everything that he can to further crack down on these things. Something that Sahad mentioned was to limit family visits even farther. And I think that the subject of family visits and even the subject of capital punishment that has come up recently in Israel is really important to focus on, because the only reason that the Israeli administration has said, I don't think that Ben-Gvir's policy is productive, is never on the basis of human rights. but always on the basis of so-called security concerns. They are fully aware of the organizing capacity that our prisoners have, and it scares them a lot. And so they are going to do everything in their power to make sure that he doesn't push it too far and cause any wave of unnecessary resistance and an inconvenience to the Israeli forces. Another issue, to go off what Sahar said about family visits, was that of prison transfers, which deeply impacts the right to family life. So far, Ben-Gvir has facilitated the punitive transfer of over 100 Palestinian prisoners to the Nefha prison in the Nakab Desert. Historically, these transfers are meant to break up organizing efforts in prison and punish prisoners by removing them from the little community that they've built and that they've developed in prison. It also further isolates them from their families, who are often not notified for months where their loved one has been transferred to. Because of this, I spoke recently when I was in Gaza last year with a prisoner who'd been, a former prisoner who'd been incarcerated for over 2 decades. And he told me that 5 years would go by where he wasn't able to be visited by his family. And this is for many different reasons that Israel has strategically put up. For example, violating international law and moving all of the prisons into Israel proper, making it nearly impossible for Palestinians in the occupied territories, especially if they have family in Gaza, to acquire permits and be able to enter Israel to visit their family. He even told me of these heartbreaking stories of his family finally acquiring a permit and then entering Israel and realizing that he had been transferred to a different prison on the other side of Israel months ago. So they've set up these systems strategically to suffocate Palestinian prisoners in every way that they can. And especially in regards to Nafha prison, I might add, it's very strategic that they've done this, moved these significant organizers in prison to Nafha. It's located in the middle of the desert. It's extremely isolated. It makes it that much more difficult to visit. There's extreme weather, especially in the summer and in the winter, and some of the worst facilities that Israel has exist in Nafha. So overall, Ben-Gvir has contributed such a great deal to the increasingly harsh policy against prisoners, but at the same time, I think it's inaccurate and dangerous to frame these violations as purely an invention of an individual. Ben-Gvir's efforts must always be recognized as simply a continuation of Israel's ever-escalating policy against Palestinian prisoners. In fact, it goes back to even farther than the beginning of the occupation, or even farther than the Nakba. Israel most literally copy-pasted its policies that in regards to detention and its military courts and the accepted treatment of prisoners from the British Mandate Handbook. For example, in my research, I've read archival reports of prison inspectors that were having these same conversations about, do Palestinians deserve food? Do they deserve access to hygiene? For example, during the mandate, they weren't seen to be deserving of more than rotten meat. Palestinian prisoners would even be handcuffed and taken to the sea to bathe. While the more civilized European prisoners would be given access to state-of-the-art bathing facilities. So it's important to understand that this is not just an invention of Ben-Gvir, but he's very effectively and perfectly maintaining the status quo in this regard. And therefore,